Good evening. How are you? Well, Thomas Jefferson tells me we've got 82 degrees, which is a sight better than we've had as recently as a week ago. And I don't think there are any heat warnings out. And there is a very slight wind, about 4 miles an hour. And the trail is pleasant, and I own it, which is the good thing about a lot of country places. While there may be residents hiding in them bar hills, they're not out and about. The current state of affairs in our government and our headlines could bring dread to anyone who has a value system that contradicts the kind of free-form, irresponsible, misleading statements by what are supposed to be the most revered institutions we have. One of our three branches is the judiciary. And I would recommend, although I don't intend to go over what I already said, but I would recommend that you take the exercise of reading online or downloading a PDF of the decision of the Supreme Court. Because there's nothing like reading it, even if you're not a lawyer, even if you think you have trouble with these kinds of documentary materials. Because to read it is to see that the court is trying to pull the wool over our eyes. Now, we never think about these things when we say it, but imagine wool being pulled over your eyes so you can't see. And so the wool is attractive, presumably, but it's not the truth. It's sort of like the parable of the cave. People live in a situation in this parable of Plato's in which they're sitting in chairs and they're looking forward, and their reality are actually shadows cast on a wall from a light behind them. And that is their reality. Wool over your eyes, shadows in front of you, false and misleading impressions of what is. Now, in the parable of the caves, there's something dramatic and depressing about this parable, because what happens is one man gets up out of his chair and climbs along the walls of the cave and comes to the light, and then all of a sudden realizes that the shadows are not real, and that what is real is this light, and so forth. He goes back into the cave to tell others, but they don't believe and can't believe and won't believe at their own risk. That's one of the problems of, well, a life that does not take for granted your existence. A life that cares to get it right. And getting it right is that old saw that the unexamined life is not worth living. But you have to see the wool over your eyes. You have to see that the court, for instance, created categories that didn't exist before and are ill-defined now as a device to mislead. So, what's new this week? Well, the decision has had fallout of various sorts, and I'll try to be briefer than my presentation last night. But for example, in the one case that is the visible example of a court at work with prosecutors and witnesses and going forward seemingly undeterred despite Trump's efforts and machinations. I'm talking about the prosecution in New York by D.A. Bragg. The judge, not too long ago, relaxed the gag order on Trump. I thought that was a mistake. I thought it showed weakness. I think it's no different now than it was, that a person of Trump's character or lack of character should not be in a position to attack prosecutors, witnesses, and so forth, the judge, any of these, the system. Not in the way he has, with the implied threat. But there's a new thing now, and it is that a letter was written by Trump's lawyers in New York asking the court to consider various things, including the recent Supreme Court decision. DA Bragg, to my surprise, agreed to continue the sentencing from July the 11th, next week, to September 18th. Now, it hasn't been called off, but this weakness of heart and resolve is distressing. Is there no one who can stand solid with legs like trees rooted into the earth, saying this is where we are, this is what we're doing, and going forward? The weakness, the frailty of key players in our national drama is distressing. It brings about dread. Is somebody else going to get away with this? Now, there is a clarion call among some of the Biden's best friends that he should consider stepping down. Now, I've heard that he has adapted his travel back and forth as an example of jet lag that corresponded to him having moments during the debate when he felt asleep or like he was going asleep. Now, I would feel better if we had this information earlier. But is this going to be some form of torture, drip, 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 until, though there may be nothing more than understandable incidents for anyone who's traveled back and forth that much, that it becomes an illness in the body politic. And we're talking about that instead of talking about the issues, instead of talking about Trump. So we have one congressman, at least as I understand it, Doggett from Texas, who has said, my friend Biden should step down, with friends like that. And we have people publicly saying this or that should happen. And then there's another strange thing going on, which I think in terms of the optics is a mistake. Hunter Biden has been at the White House. Okay, that's fine, family. But he's also been attending meetings that Biden's at. And the story is he's there to help Biden stay the course. That is, to stay in office. Now, does that mean he needs that? Does that mean they're just giving him support for his position? I don't know. But Hunter Biden shouldn't be in the political picture. Perhaps in the family picture, but not in the political picture. And he shouldn't be at briefings, I don't think. But that's just me. Another step forward for those steps backwards. Rudy Giuliani has lost his New York law license. Now, the people who never knew him, that seems quite appropriate. It seems quite appropriate to me. But I can't wrap my mind around the Rudy I knew as a young puppy prosecutor who was 2 years ahead of me in the office. I think that's about right. And whom I did cases with, particularly one case involving lawyers and so forth. And we had a suppression hearing. And it was fun working with Rudy because he was a consummate lawyer. He was very good. And he seemed to me, in my experience, to reach out and to help others. And now we have this guy with a kind of mental depravity running around the country lying for Trump. Is he worth it? Well, perhaps not when the guy's losing all of his property, his reputation, his law license, and perhaps his freedom. It's a strange, strange thing. And it is an echo of what happened in Watergate when I was younger, and I didn't know any of those people. I saw him in the media. And then as I became a prosecutor, those who kind of overlapped, I got to know. And I met some powerful and capable people who were great examples for a young lawyer. So what do we have? We have these sycophants, sick, S-I-C-K, and they come from all dimensions. Great professionals, businessmen, donors, elected officials, and there's some warped and twisted way they look at the world. And I guess it is they figure, I'm going to get mine. And they do, and they take it. And they are the temptation for good people to say, well, if they can do that, maybe I should do that. But one is a lost soul when one does something like that. I was in court today at a bail hearing, and we were appealing a different bail hearing that went against our client. We thought we had additional facts and so forth, and so you argued from a lower court to a circuit court. Now, I'm not going to beat my chest and say we were right or whatever. We did win the motion. That is, we did find conditions of bail for our client. But the thing that struck me as I waited, because while we were on the calendar, there were 4 matters on the calendar, and the man who was the judge I knew as a lawyer in private practice, and I had not appeared to him since he went on the bench. And I made mention of the fact that I wished him a belated congratulations for his ascendance into the role of the judge. The thing about the event was we had a judge who was patient and listened to both sides, including the prosecution, that had a non-frivolous argument about bail. And we had briefs, and we had proffers of evidence, and we had a witness. And the case could have gone either way, but the judge decided to give our client an opportunity with no prior record to be released on bail. Now, a whole other chapter begins after that, and no one can say at this stage, because we haven't had discovery, where it will go. But it's not the individual case. I was standing and sitting in court with a colleague of mine, and I was in a position to be able to admire the work he did while we were there. And it seemed to me that's what the law is about, this controlled inquiry into what is just and right. But if the president was in that room, it would have been a very different proceeding. Now, it's unlikely that he would be in that particular courthouse. But we've seen what he did in another courthouse when he was on the wrong end of it. He's not there as a lawyer, certainly, there as a party. That's what we have to get back to. And I can't say, I won't have other opportunities and have different reactions. But my best moments in court have been my surprise at how right counsel, witnesses, and court act. And between my experience in the legislative function and individually representing people, the difference is dramatic in this way. If you represent an individual, you are affecting that one person, or several if there are several defendants in a case. And even in a civil case, you have these kinds of considerations. But when you pass legislation, if you're not posing and you believe that the legislation is right and necessary, the problem is the unintended consequences you had not considered, which can affect a few people, thousands of people, millions of people. Now, I'm not saying the legislative function is poor, But it's easy to be reckless. And if you add into that using an issue to raise money for a campaign and don't care so much about the people and institutions that are affected, then what you get is unjust and perhaps insane. A large segment of our society presently has been poisoned by Trump and all the maggot followers that have amassed around him. That is an organized minority, 30 or 40%, are very dangerous to an enlightened majority that is torn by participating in this unpleasantness and looks to do something else, which is part of the means by which we find ourselves sitting on the sidelines. So what we have to do is be vigilant. We have to understand the pain we're going to feel, psychic pain, for how our institutions are under attack and being compromised, and thus so is our freedom and the values we have for democracy. And what we feel is not just our values, but they're being tested by a dictator or a wannabe dictator who's made it very clear that that's what he's about. So, flashing through my mind was a speech by Ted Kennedy in 1980. And I can't shake it out of my head. It's like a tune. And I sat at the Democratic convention with his family when he gave that speech, because I worked on his primary campaign in New York and was old enough to be an adult with some responsibility. And he talked about how the dream lives on, and he may have been talking about himself at that time. But there was a time in Atlanta in 1988. I was also a delegate. Well, I wasn't a delegate in New York. I was there. I had a license to be on the floor and stuff like that of the convention. But I was a delegate in 1988 in Atlanta. And Jesse Jackson, having conceded that he could not amass support for a presidential run, said, "The Lord is not yet through with me. There are other things I have to do." That's the spirit of a life of meaning. It doesn't have to be what Jesse Jackson said. It doesn't have to be the way Ted Kennedy said it. These may not be your kind of politicians. But the best in spirit and mind have something that suggests to us that this is the kind of public servant that we want. And these days, we are so surrounded by irresolute cowards that we're all at risk. So we have to prod, not like some do with a cow, our elected representatives, our neighbors, our friends, to do the right thing. Because we're going to wake up some morning in which we see the people whose views we enjoy sitting in camps and people being charged with bullshit crimes, just like you'd expect in a dictatorship, which is the object of Trump's campaign. So that's what I got to say here on in the Cathedral of Trees, and I look forward to talking to you tomorrow. Bye-bye.